Good evening, everybody. Um, Today we have Jasper Waugh-Quaserbarth. He's my colleague, and he's a cultural anthropologist and folklorist who specializes in material cultural studies, craft studies, and environmental anthropology. From 2011 to 2013, he served as a program manager at the Asian Cultural History program in the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., where he coordinated projects on craft, musical, and religious traditions in Central, South, and East Asia. Since 2013, he has conducted multi-site ethnographic research in the Appalachian Mountains of the United States and the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where he investigates the connections of mountains, forest environments, and musical instruments craft. He is the fresh. Last year, he has graduated from the University of Kentucky, and this his research culminated in his dissertation at the University of Kentucky and is the basis of forthcoming his book, Finding the Sinking Suppressed Craft, Forest Environment, and Musical Instrument Workers in Appalachia. Currently, he serves as a postdoctoral scholar in the Center for Folklore Studies at the Ohio State University, where he coordinates collaborative ethnographic projects rooted in the center's archive. I have been known him since 2014. So he is a very talented and scholarly person who's working on this area for the last couple of many years. So welcome, Jasper. And today we are happy to have you. And this is your time. Please.
Uh, Thank you, Bhansane-san, for that introduction, and to Anandita and Waluvan for having me here today as well. I appreciate it. I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen to share a presentation that I have for this. You can see some photos and things like that as well. So. So today I'm going to talk about some reflections from the collections, challenges and opportunities in museum anthropology as I've seen it through my career in museum anthropology and folklore. It's going to be kind of like a sort of practical guide and a sort of reflection, although I look forward to digging into some of these theoretical questions that come out of it as well with you all. So I currently have a research appointment with the Asian Cultural History program at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where I served for many years. Is anyone seeing, are you all seeing my screen share? Okay.
Yes, Jasper. Yes, we can see.
You're seeing it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I wasn't sure if those messages were for me or not. Yeah, so, and I currently also have a research appointment with the Center for Folklore Studies at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio in the United States, which is the large university for the state of Ohio. It's one of the largest universities in the United States. So just a couple of words on museum anthropology, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with, but just maybe coming from the context in the United States a little bit more. Museum anthropology was really crucial to the development of the discipline as a whole in the United States. And you can see our friend Franz Boas here, who's kind of normally considered to be one of the fathers of American anthropology, really got his start working in the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. as well. So these kind of iconic photos of him and in this case, wearing Pacific Northwest Pocuyulo dress and with a fan, were taken in those offices where I would later work myself. So they've always kind of been an inspiration. However, as the focus of anthropology moved away from the collections of material culture, and anthropologists became rightfully very critical of the role of museums in colonial and colonizing anthropology. Anthropology as a whole has shifted away from museums in a lot of ways in the discipline. However, we have the Council for Museum Anthropology in the United States, which produces this journal, which provides important theoretical insights to the discipline as a whole. And it's also really important to remember that museum anthropology is basically the public's entrance into anthropology in most cases today. So the ways that the average sort of person encounters anthropology in the US is through going to museum exhibits or encountering other sort of things that museums produce. So just a quick sketch of where I'm going, where I've been and where I'm going. You can see me there as a young anthropologist inspecting some collections at the National Museum of Natural History. I'll talk about a couple of different projects we did. I worked on there within the Asian Cultural History program at the National Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian. That's the network of national museums for the United States. And sort of some of the challenges and opportunities that surface at all these stages. Then I'm going to talk about a project that I collaborated on at the University of Kentucky at the Appalachian Center, which is a outreach center through the university, advising some local museums in an international context. And finally, I'll talk about the work that I'm currently doing at the Center for Folklore Studies and Folklore Archives at the Ohio State University, doing collaborative projects with local museums. So I'm going to present some of these sort of challenges and opportunities that exist through these different kinds of projects in very different kinds of contexts, going from what's ostensibly one of the largest anthropology museums in the world to the very small local museums that we see as well. So what do we do with all these things? So what does it look like in the everyday collections work in a large museum in the US? So everyday tasks in a large museum at the National Museum of Natural History often revolved around sort of collections management. There's millions of objects that we have in the collections there. And they require constant inventory as well as referral for restoration. Some of these objects are quite old and need to be sort of checked in on, and questions arise about the restoration. Specifically about in 2012 in Washington, D.C., we had a very atypical earthquake. And so we had to go through all of our collections and sort of look at what the damage that the earthquake did. That was a major job for us. And also, as the museum is the National Museum of the United States, it has an obligation to the public. So often we would get questions from the public about specific things in the collections, and we would need to photograph those and gather information if there was any inquiry. Because it's the National Museum, the public interest comes first. So often a lot of everyday tasks were just going into the collections and photographing and bringing out information about those objects. Just something that's interesting to note about this setup of this National Museum is that the museum and its support center are two distinct entities. So if you've been to Washington, D.C. and the National Mall, where the U.S. Capitol building is and all of these museum buildings are, you can go to the Natural History Museum, but that museum itself has very few of the actual objects that are part of the collection. Most of them are in a museum center about 20 kilometers outside of the city, where most of the collections are actually held and up to sort of world-class, state-of-the-art standards. The challenges and opportunities that arise in these spaces, the opportunities afforded by large collections are kind of innumerable for research and exhibition. The anthropology department alone has 3 million objects, in addition to 650,000 photographs, 11,000 audio recordings, and miles and miles and miles of written field notes. And manuscripts. So really there's something, you could never stop doing exhibits by combining these kind of objects in different ways. That being said, being part of the national government and a large institution, there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that you sort of have to navigate in order to use these objects in exhibitions or demonstrate or show them to the public. And often in collections this size, the needs of specific items can be overlooked. So I think people are still dealing with, the collections managers are still dealing with the outcomes of this earthquake that was almost 10 years ago now, because there are so many items and objects in the collections. And something that I've really thought about a lot recently is some ontological questions about the morality of collections. I think anthropologists have done a really good job of thinking through this sort of colonial legacy of museum collections, and the Smithsonian is definitely part of that case. A lot of these collections were collected in the early 20th century by ostensibly colonial agents, taking them from their original context. And I think that Museum Anthropology has thought about that and thinking through questions of repatriation will. But there's still some ontological questions that we can address here, specifically with objects of religious or spiritual significance. So this is a picture that I took in our collections that's just very telling, you know, of a goddess in the sort of trapped in this system of bureaucratic management of objects. And something dear to my heart are musical instruments and these objects that exist to be played. They're sort of only reason to be in the world is to make music. So what does this mean when these instruments are sort of strapped down and kept locked away for preservation for the future? So some of these questions come up in these large museum contexts when things are often stored and kept away for many years. Partnering through exhibitions, I'll now talk about one of the major exhibition projects that I worked on when I was the program manager for the Asian Cultural History program, and talking about how you can use exhibitions to partner with other museums internationally. So this was a project working with the National Museums of Turkmenistan. The Ancient Arts Today was the name of the exhibition. And it was an exhibition primarily based around the textiles of Turkmenistan, both sort of what they would classify as traditional arts and textiles in the forms of carpets and other kinds of pile weaving, as well as more modern expressions such as Gobelin weaving that you can see here in the National Museum of Art, Ashgabat. So what this project was a international collaboration between our National Museum in Washington, D.C. and the network of national museums in Turkmenistan, with the goal of sort of creating a space of collaboration for scholars from the two museum systems, especially with a country that doesn't collaborate very often internationally. They like to sort of keep to themselves in these spaces a lot. So it really afforded this opportunity for us to sort of show each other what we had in our collections and create an exhibit around it, and show off some of these wonderful works of art and examples of sort of human cultural heritage to the world that often don't get seen in their own national contexts. So here's just a couple examples from the exhibit when it was launched. We had a lot of different, we were able to bring in a lot of musicians from Turkmenistan and poets and dancers and things like that. So it became this whole sort of space of also cultural interchange as well. So not only the objects, but the amount of people that were able to come over for the exhibit opening created this space of dialogue. And these visiting artists, musicians, dancers, you know, went around Washington, D.C. And we had some like really amazing experiences where these folks who don't get out of Turkmenistan very often, and people in the US who may or may not even be aware that this country even exists, had these opportunity to interface in the streets of Washington, D.C., which was fantastic. And show off just the really amazing sort of legacy of textiles in Turkmenistan. You can see here in this bottom picture a picture of the two women holding up the exhibit catalog, and you could sort of notice the opulent space in which this exhibit was happening. And that sort of clues into a couple of facts about these international, through working through this large museum, these sort of international collaborations look like in their context, and how we can sort of think through some challenges there as well. So some opportunities that are afforded by this are increased dialogue amongst international colleagues, specifically colleagues that may not have a chance to interact at all otherwise, as well as new audiences for collections that would not maybe travel otherwise either. So the collections potentially would never have left Turkmenistan, and people in the US potentially would never go to this country and understand and get a sense to see what this place is like and what this culture is like. The other thing about these large sort of cultural interchanges, especially in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., is that there's a lot of funding available from the government and from corporate sources for this kind of work, because it functions as this kind of soft diplomacy, these diplomatic spaces where everybody can feel good about promoting culture, and corporate entities can sort of exercise their agency through their money in funding these things, and show off their sort of best face. That being said, that creates a lot of stakeholders with many different kinds of objectives, and you're often left to navigate a lot of political questions that you might not think would be the case in a exhibit about textiles, for instance. As anthropologists, I think we're aware that every action is political, but it's just another thing to have to think through. So in the case of Turkmenistan, the president's authority is always on display, and that was something that was a sort of a cultural sort of context that we were constantly negotiating through this process. So that was a sort of high level, sponsored by the diplomats and by corporations. So I wanted to give an example from working at the National Museum, of working on a more community-oriented project, which was the Sikh Heritage Project that started in 2002 after the September 11th attacks in the United States. In 2001, a lot of very sort of uneducated and misguided American citizens were blaming Sikhs for the attack, based on miseducation and a misunderstanding of the world. And so we were approached by the Sikh community in Washington, D.C. about doing a exhibit on their lives, their culture, their religion. And so we met with a group of this sort of elders and of the community, and developed this exhibit. And the exhibit was a fairly kind of standard anthropological exhibit, sort of demonstrating the central tenets of religion and Sikh life. But what happened to the exhibit after its tenure at the museum is what I kind of want to focus on, and that's where I came in. Basically, what happened was the exhibit, our program built the scaffolding of the exhibit in terms of the signage and the vitrines, the cases that things went in. But we designed it in a flexible way, in such that local people's objects, instead of the museum's objects, would be the things that would feed into the exhibit. So people would feel ownership over the exhibition process, and be able to tell the story in their own way as well through their objects. So you can see here, for instance, these two men bringing in an 18th century copy of the Janam Sahi, to be included in the exhibit, which was also then by including the exhibit was also using the museum resources of conservators and restoration to be able to look at these objects that maybe wouldn't have been able to have that high level of conservation attention otherwise. And so what happened after that was once the exhibit closed after several years in Washington, D.C. at the Museum of Natural History, it began traveling around the U.S. and North America, and it's been in 6 different cities, I think, since then. And at each stage, the exhibit takes on objects from the local Sikh community. So if it moves to California, the only things that move are there's a couple of objects that move, but it's mainly just the scaffolding around it, so the signage and the vitrines. And then the local Sikh community actually brings in the objects that will be displayed. And so what you get as a result is, in these sort of local and regional contexts, the local Sikh community responding very well and feeling like they're continually a part of the project, even though it's been going on for almost 20 years now. And so, you can see this picture here at the Gurdwara, where, people are being led in a prayer, and there's a sort of projection of the project in the background. This project was really fulfilling because how much the community was bought into the project. And how much they appreciated this sort of scaffolding around it. So the opportunities and challenges that it afforded was it really democratized the exhibition project and allowed expertise to be shared. So it wasn't necessarily just the curator or the people working on the project that were demonstrating their expertise over these types of material culture or art, but actually the everyday citizens who had these things in their objects in their collections to bring them out and demonstrate their knowledge and expertise about these things that are central to their identity. The other important thing that it does is it brings private collections out to the public. So things that maybe only were visible to families in their homes or to people in the local community became available to a much broader public. For instance, this set of 18th century steel and gold damas armor that was able to come out from a private collection, be restored, and then be on public display for everyone to look at. A couple of the challenges that come out are it relies on funding through partnering communities. So in communities that maybe there are a lot of communities that this is not a viable option for. They maybe don't have the funding to keep the project going alive, or don't have the funding to be able to send objects that are precious throughout the U.S. or North America. And lastly, it relies on a lot of community cohesion and vision. So this project, there was not a lot of arguing sort of about what the main themes were going to be. But if you are in a community that's maybe a little bit more fractured than the Sikh community, diaspora community in the U.S. and in Canada, then that could present a lot more challenges. So I left my role at the Smithsonian and took on more of an advisory role there. I continued to do research there, but I left in 2013 to pursue my doctoral degree. And I went to the University of Kentucky, where I started working on research projects in the region of the U.S. that I'm originally from, which are this mountain range called the Appalachian Mountains. In the eastern United States. I'm originally from the state of West Virginia. Washington, D.C. is here, and this is where the university was that I attended in Kentucky. And what we were doing is working with local museums. So this area, this mountain region of the United States, is sort of a very economically depressed region for a lot of different reasons, but mainly it has to rely on historical reliance on extractive industry through today and the sort of impacts of that. But we were looking into thinking about local museums as a sort of economic development project in eastern Kentucky, which is in this Appalachian region. And so we were looking to this other mountain region in the Pyrenees, in Spain, in France, and Andorra, just sort of as a comparative context to see what we could learn in these spaces, and set up a project where we would sort of think through what did local museums look like in one mountain region that's struggling with economic development and another, and what lessons can be learned from comparing the two. So this is just a shot of kind of what a typical local museum in the Appalachian region looks like, a museum in eastern Kentucky. You can notice that it's there's a lot of sort of things about the sort of agricultural livelihood of the place. A lot of objects on display. Pretty much the entire place is kind of filled up like this, and a lot of exhibition signage from throughout the years still on display. So what we found was that these local museums were often competing against each other. So because there's so many, the divisions of the state are into these counties, and each of the counties has its own idea for its economic development. And so that they would have museums that were basically fulfilling the same function, despite being very close to each other. So they're sort of competing for the same groups of tourists, say, to come in and spend money there, which is kind of counteracting the processes of economic development. So in the Pyrenees, what we saw was actually community museums actually organizing themselves into networks and to make sure that they didn't replicate anything that was happening close by. So what you would have is a group of museums, local museums coming together, such as this list here, and then these are the state organizations that sponsored them. And then actually creating like programs like passports or special discounts so that you would visit all of these museums instead of sort of pitting them against each other in competition like we saw in Eastern Kentucky and throughout the U.S. And so this was a basis of a project that we were interested in continuing to pursuing. The idea was going to be to bring people from Eastern Kentucky to Catalonia and people from Catalonia and the Pyrenees to Eastern Kentucky. But ultimately, we were not funded by the State Department in the ways that I had been in the past, working on that sort of larger, more lavish project. And so this is just another example of a small local community museum on African American heritage in Eastern Kentucky. So some opportunities and challenges that working in these local museum contexts afforded. Small museums are dependent on volunteer labor with full-time workers, so you definitely don't have the full-time collections managers or researchers that you see at these large museums, meaning that they have to make often difficult choices about how to proceed with their collections, their exhibitions, and what else they're doing. Resources are very thin for collection preservation, facilities, and exhibit production. So that's why you kind of see these sort of buildings that are kind of taken over by all of the collections because there's no place to put all the collections, and there's no way to sort of swap in and out exhibits. They're in very competitive funding streams, so they don't get the same kind of attention that these large museums do because they're all competing against each other, as I said. However, they are very deeply entrenched in their local communities, which allows for deeper engagement and a feeling of ownership over the museum practice that I think that we don't see at larger museums. And they're better suited, for that reason, they're better suited to cater to local needs. So in this case, we see the museum here, but then next to it, they were growing a community garden in that same space and growing heirloom varieties of vegetables. So not only sort of demonstrating the heritage, agricultural heritage of the area, but also working to feed these communities that are very food insecure as well. So the last thing I'll talk about is my current community sort of support project and working through with local museums and archives in the state of Ohio. And I'm seeing this as a much more successful pattern than the previous one, the working between Appalachian local museums and Catalonian, because it's a very collaborative project, and it's less of a sort of top-down approach to sort of understanding how local museums function and what we can do as anthropologists to help them continue to do so and serve their communities well. So this is based around the Ohio Field School Initiative, which is a project that I coordinate now in southeastern Ohio, so still in this Appalachian region, but here in the state of Ohio. I coordinate this project. It's a service learning project, so we take on 12 students who are interested in learning ethnographic methods, and we bring them from the city of Columbus, where the university is, to southeast Ohio, the mountain region in the state, to work with local community partners. So often these community partners are local museums and archives. What we do is we set the students up working on an ethnographic project that can be in service to something that this local community organization needs. So this specific example that you're seeing here is with a local history archive and museum. And although they have their collections managed pretty well for a local museum, none of this information was being digitized, and a lot of it was being lost because it's still in paper format. So our two students worked with the director to digitize a lot of this material and provide it back to them, to their archives, as well as provide a copy for our own archives at the Center for Folklore Studies at the Ohio State University. So the students work closely for a week with these community partners, developing ethnographic skills such as interviewing, practicing participant observation, writing lots of field notes, as well as some other methods that maybe aren't taught as much, but are also very important to doing ethnographic work, such as scanning, digitization, and photographs, things that are becoming more important as we're expanding our ethnographic tool sets. So what ends up coming out of this are three things. One, the local archive, local history archive and museum gets digital copies of all these things that we produce, helping them towards their mission of digitizing and consolidating their collections. Our folklore archives gets a copy as well, so we're able to build up our understanding of folklore in the state of Ohio. And last, the students produce a information for the public about this organization in their archives. So a lot of these organizations don't have any web presence at all. So we're able to produce a website and a digital gallery where they can present the information that they found and sort of give a sort of landing page for these local community organizations. So you can see those at that link here at the bottom. We can send that out later if people are interested in looking at those links and these things that the students produce. So some of the challenges and opportunities from this project that are emerging, it really takes long-term collaboration to build trust. It's not something you can kind of show up and just do. These are things that we've been building for years, and trust in the students to really deliver on projects as well that will benefit the community. We're finding that our institutional networks within our university system often don't value this kind of time and resources needed to develop these collaborative projects that are in service to community members as well, instead prioritizing things like publication for publication's sake and more bureaucratic goals. However, there's a lot of opportunities. This has been one of the most fulfilling projects that I've worked on. We're able to leverage our archival resources to not only build our own institutional archive, but the local archive as well. So we're able to, use our scanners that we have, use our computer platforms that we have, use our digital recorders to bring things to the community, technology that they perhaps could not afford otherwise, and help them sort of accomplish some of their main goals. We're also able to leverage our educational resources. So these students are not only learning ethnographic methods, and they're signing up to take a course in ethnographic methods, but we're able to use the presence of the students and their learning as a way to help communities with projects that they don't have time or resources to accomplilich. So these couple photos that you can see here are a good example of that. These are two students who are working with a community organization that's not a local museum and not a local archive, but rather a watershed restoration group. So they're working on restoring a watershed, a body of water from the environmental impacts of the coal industry. And you can get a sense of that here. This is all material that's left over after the coal industry left. Basically the refuse created by producing coal. And this was part of a series of photographs that this organization had taken in the inception of their organization, but as they're focused on cleaning up the water, they never had a chance to really to record these photos, to take down information about their context and importance, things that are very central to our understandings as museum and archival anthropologists. And so these students were able to interview people who worked on these projects over the year and provide this context to these photos, and then produce a digital gallery for public consumption from that information. So again, we're telling a story that's really important to tell for the region and also for the country, through student involvement and students learning these processes as they go. So the student service learning enables capacity building from the bottom up. So frequently in my time at the National Museum in Washington, D.C., we would be invited on these kind of capacity building lecture series, and we would go to places around the world and sort of talk about the capacity that we had as a large museum, and the best practices from a large museum, and often talking to smaller communities, smaller community museums about this, where these ideas of capacity weren't feasible because of the resources that they had. So I'm thinking now of what are the more sustainable ways of offering capacity building for local museums in order to build from the bottom up instead of a sort of top-down imposition of best practices. And I'm seeing this student service as a way forward, and would be happy to talk more about it with you all. That's all I have. That's what I'm currently working on, and I appreciate you all listening to me. I'm very excited to hear any questions that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a great lecture, and the floor is open for questions. If anybody have any question or any discussion, they can go for it. Uh, Before that, in chat there is no question, so I would like to ask my question. Have you been to India? Means, have you seen Indian museums?
I have not been to India. No, no, and that's what I'm interested in, like that like scale. So yeah, I'd like to hear like what are some of like the issues or challenges in museums that you all are seeing.
Because I really wanted to know what is the difference between the Indian museums and the museums you associate with. So the working style and everything.
Yeah, I don't. I think right before I was in the Asian Cultural History program, they were working on a project on Sikhism in northern India, and we're doing trips to India. I haven't seen Indian museums, so I wish I could comment on that more. It is really interesting, though. I've done a lot of work in East Asia and Central Asia as well, and so it is very interesting to sort of confront the different cultural. We have this common method, or this common, museum is this common space, but our sort of cultural backgrounds really influence how we interact with that space. So, working in post-Soviet states, for instance, there's a lot of, and the U.S. too, but in post-Soviet states, there's a lot of nationalism that creeps into the museum system that maybe you don't see in other places, and so that was something that was always that I had to navigate in working in those spaces. And yeah, I would imagine though that there's probably lots of like differences between scale, right? Things that are funded heavily by like the highest levels of government versus local museums where people are just trying to demonstrate their local culture and what's happening. So I think that we have that maybe that scale as well in the US, right?
Am I audible? Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was some technical glitch. I couldn't be audible. So there is one interesting question from Prabhakaran that how could we apply ethnographic approach in applied anthropology or sociology? Can it be applied to lifelong learning research?
Yeah, I think so. I think that we're seeing like in the Ohio Field School project that I'm saying I was just talking about. I think that can be uh, applied to lifelong learning. We often have scholars from that join the class a uh, from a broad diversity of backgrounds and ages as well. So it's not just a sort of stereotypical university early 20s student, for example. And then also because it's a collaborative project, we're constantly talking about the research goals with our community partners. So the ethnographic process really comes out and is something that you share with the community instead of just sort of showing up and documenting things and maybe returning some of that information. So I think through making it a very collaborative project where the methods and the goals are really out there in the open, it's definitely something that can uh, um, educate not only the students but the instructors, community partners as well.
So there is one more question. Is there any opportunities in local museums for exchange of materials with the big ones?
Yeah, there's so this the Smithsonian Institution, they have a program that allows small local museums to become like affiliated with the larger museum system. So they get access to some funding from that, as well as like advertising and maybe exhibits as well. So the exhibits can, if they're finished at the National Museum, will then go to these smaller local museums. Um, that being said, I think that a lot of the resources, tend to go towards these bigger museums than the smaller museums, and they fulfill a different sort of niche. Um, with the Sikh Heritage Project that I was describing, the places where that project was going was actual local museums as well. So that's a good example of how like it sort of comes out of the main national museum circuit and then goes out to these smaller local museums and regional museums. So there is some connection, but I think that the way that the funding in politics works on the larger scale doesn't takes away a lot from the local museums. So the local museums have to be sort of more crafty and thoughtful about how they are going to present themselves in these larger museums that have school buses full of children arriving daily. And these multi-million dollar grants from corporations and government agencies. Yeah.
There is one more question, but I'm not clear with it. I would like Vijayshri to please you directly ask question from sir. That will be really great help for you. Vijayshri, please, can you please ask the question?
Hello. Hello. Hi. I'm audible, I hope.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi. This is Vijayashri from Bangalore. I have a question. So, when there is a difference of opinion between the local museum and the large state-funded museums regarding the representation of local culture, how do you then navigate such situations? When there is an opposite between this authorized heritage discourse of what the local culture is, then and then there's on the one hand there's a local community who have an own idea of their own culture. So when there is a schism here, how do we then navigate this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It's something I think about a lot, and I think I was trying to sort of hint towards that when I was talking about these like large international museum projects, because you get a very the sort of national idea of what the project is, right, and what the culture is. So just to sort of back up on this slide. So like this carpet motif, for instance, is like the national carpet motif of Turkmenistan, but it has a lot of different local meanings as well that are often washed out in terms of the representation nationally. And just in my area in the U.S. as well, we have national representations of the Appalachian of the mountain region that are in direct conflict with what we see actually happening locally on the ground. So, maybe I would have used to think that the sort of larger national exhibits are the way to counter those kinds of issues. And now I'm seeing more about, I think it's more important to just try and build the capacity from the bottom up, build the capacity of the local museums, help them have a digital presence so that they can reach a wider audience, so that they can be telling these stories and demonstrating these narratives through their collections themselves instead of relying on the sort of national system to do it for them. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I guess she is satisfied with your answer. We have the next question by Tejender, and he wants to know that in your community advisory projects, like in local museums, how much challenges do you face in context to inclusiveness and physical accessibility of the museums, basically for the people who are disabled?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something we think a lot about, paying attention to the silences as well. So a lot of these community partners are often the people who are most visible. So like they're community organizations that are very visible. They have maybe an office on the main street of the town, or somebody, they're connected to networks that through the university that you might find people, even if they're working in these rural areas. So that's something that we're mindful of, and we do a lot of ethnographic survey work as well in the communities that we work in, to make sure that we're reaching lots of other people who maybe aren't in those spaces, when we're generating ideas about the future of a collaborative project. So it involves a lot of survey work. That's sort of really important part of ethnographic work. That's, I think, really crucial to museum anthropology, which is just getting out there and talking to as many people as possible. I think that the digitization practices have a lot to offer those spaces. A lot of times those small community organizations and local museums don't have the resources to be able to think, or maybe not think through, but practice these inclusive practices that you're mentioning, as well as they probably should. So if we can leverage our resources to help people digitize things and bring them to digital platforms that sort of open up this accessibility and inclusivity, I think that's a great way to go. Like all of our websites that we develop, for example, accessibility is a primary principle that we take forward. So, all of our images are able to be read by by online reading programs for people who maybe don't see well or hard of hearing, and we work to really transcribe a lot of our interviews so that people who are hard of hearing can still read them. So working with local community museums to help improve their accessibility and inclusivity, I think, is a major thing that we think about and try to bring to the table. Thank you. That's a really great question and something we should all be really thinking about.
In the current situation, means what is the means how much importance should we give to digitalization?
Yeah, I think that that's something a lot of people are thinking about right now, and I appreciate the question in this current context as well, when people physically cannot go to museums because they're these large public spaces. I think that digitization it offers a lot. Um, it offers a sort of democratization of collections, right? People can, if you have an internet connection, you can look at these exhibits, you can look at these objects. And it's getting really great as well, like 3D imaging. You can do 3D imaging of objects in your collections from, a smartphone now, which is really kind of incredible. And it allows people a lot more access. But there is something lost when you're not dealing directly with the object, I think. So that's where I think that ethnographers are really have an important role to play in this. And thinking about, what's the future of this practice beyond the sort of technical implementation of it. So you see a lot of grants, for example, for the digitization of collections, but we have to think beyond to the larger social context rather than just the technological implementation. So that's where we can put our work as ethnographers to work on these projects as museum anthropologists by sort of figuring out, doing ethnographies not only around the objects, but also the experience of those objects, and making sure that what we're trying to communicate from the objects digitally is actually being the thing that's being taken away from those who are sort of consuming that experience. Great.
No more questions, but I really want you to come to Himachal Pradesh because I have been living there for like 6 years, and the folklores and the documentation of the traditional musical instruments and lot more things are yet not discovered, and I guess you will find it really fascinating to discover all those deities and the folklores and the religious practices associated with each other. So
Yeah, I would love to come. Yeah, let's make it happen.
So I would like Maluvan sir to take the charge and thank him.
So thank you so much, Jasper, for agreeing on a short notice to have the today. So we are having a party series for these last couple of days. It was really, really fascinating. Lots of people were um, um, discussing various kinds of issues from the India and other parts of India. So today you are having a wonderful and fantastic, very rich, informative presentations. I hope that it have been enhanced the most of the people who are here. So thank you so much, Anita Ghosh, for hosting this event today. And we would have to thank Asper and inviting Jasper and to have him his presentations today. So on behalf of Asper, so I have to thank Walluvan. So he is the one who asked me to invite Jasper. So we have Jasper and Anita, he was hosting, and everybody, the participants. So thank you so much for everybody to be here. I think Jasper might have enjoyed today presentations and the event with the community. So we would like to have Jasper for the future work and collaborative, any kind of rich opportunities to work with Asper and other parts of people. Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to working with you all some more. Sure. So thanks to the organization, and again to Anahita and to Wadwan for setting this up. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Thank you.
Feel free to contact me. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.